Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see so many faces here. Welcome to the sort of end of the semester for the Capstone course in Sustainable Development. This will be a chance to hear about the great projects that the students have been working on with their clients this fall. Before we jump right in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge some of the key people who've made this possible. So Stuart, the other instructor, and I wanted to take a moment to especially acknowledge Rachel and Jordana's contributions to the class. Thank you for all you've done. Also, more generally, the leadership in the department from Ruth, Jason, Natalie and Jessica for really having the vision of the program and taking all the steps to make it sort of work from A to Z. So thanks for all your support. In terms of the structure for today, we have 10-minute presentations from each of the four groups. Then we'll have 5 minutes for questions after each presentation before moving on to the next one. We are going to be passing around a microphone when we take questions. So if you would, please wait until the microphone gets to you because we're recording and want to be able to hear all of your comments and questions. We ask that unless you absolutely have another commitment, please try to stay, not only through your presentation, but until we wrap, which will be well before 4 o'clock, probably by 3:15 or so. And we hope at that point people can stick around, mingle, talk, share experiences, and have some cookies and coffee and water and such. So with that, just wanted to say thanks again to all the students and everybody here, and looking forward to your 10-minute presentations. Okay, anything else, Stuart? All right, so let's jump in then with the first project here from one of Stuart's groups. How do environmental impact statements address climate change in 2016?
So we did how do environmental impact statements address climate change in 2016. I'm Taylor. I'm a senior at Columbia College studying sustainable development. This is Selekshana, and our group is also Giovanna, Saloni, and Omri. So I'm just going to go over who our project client is, what exactly is an EIS, and what did we do. So our project client was the Saban Center on Climate Change Law, and they researched novel ways to legally address climate change, and we worked with one of the lawyers there named Jessica Wenz. So what exactly is an EIS? It's an environmental impact statement, and whenever a federal agency wants to take an action that will have significant effect on the environment, they have to have an EIS by law because NEPA requires it. Also, going off of that, this is a tool for agencies to use to see what the climate change impacts are. So what did we do? We evaluated EIS to see how they comply with the Council on Environmental Quality. And the Council on Environmental Quality is a government or executive agency, and they just released in August of 2016 new guidances on how to address climate change and greenhouse gas emissions for these EISs. So next, our methodology, our project steps, our EISs by category, our considerations, and the overview. So our project steps, first we defined objectives with Jessica, and then we created a rubric for scoring these EISs with the CEQ guidance. Then we evaluated 31 of these EISs and created a user-friendly database. After that, we analyzed for key trends and compiled our findings into a written report. So our EISs by category, as I said, we looked at 31 different EISs. We separated them into 3 different categories: natural resource management, fossil fuels, and built infrastructure. And to have accurate analysis on all of these, we had 2 people read each EIS and make sure everything was going right. So we had 5 focus considerations: emissions, mitigation, alternatives, effects of climate change, and adaptation. And these 5 really are important in the EISs that we looked at because they can really tell whether these EISs really looked at climate change and GHG emissions. So this is just an overview of where all of our EISs were. Like you can see Puerto Rico, Alaska, California, just many different places that they are.
All right, so I'm going to talk about our results for a little bit. So as Taylor said, we created a rubric, and that rubric was divided into 2 sections. The first was the effects of the action on climate change. The second was the effects of climate change on the action. So in the first section, the effects of action on climate change, we looked at what is the carbon footprint of this project. Are they addressing that? So here we have a graph with kind of three of our major findings from this section of the rubric. So the first, the direct emissions question asks, does the agency quantitatively or qualitatively in-depth account for direct emissions? And direct emissions are those that are owned or controlled by the agency or the project itself. So an example would be construction emissions or operational emissions. So for an airport project we had, operational emissions would be the emissions from the airplanes. We see that 68% of the EISs complied in this category, and that means they either they did quantitatively or qualitatively address this section, or it was not applicable because there were no emissions. So the second question asks the same thing except for indirect emissions. And indirect emissions are not kind of directly owned or controlled by the project and are foreseen and kind of are the result of a project. So one example is induced vehicle trips, so vehicle miles traveled because of the project. Or another example of an absence of indirect emissions is we looked at a project that was a coal export facility on the Gulf Coast, and they didn't account for the combustion of the coal. So that's a downstream emission that they ignored, so they received a no in this category. As you can see, the rate of compliance falls down to 55% because these are kind of less obvious sources of emissions and require a more holistic view of the project than many of the agencies were doing. Then finally, you can see compliance falls a ton down to 26% for mitigation. And this question asks, does the agency assess or identify mitigation measures that would reduce or minimize greenhouse gas emissions? And very few of the projects did. And this really shows that, yes, these agencies are accounting for the carbon footprint of their projects, but they're not taking the next step. How do we reduce that carbon footprint? And many of the agencies use language like, these emissions are just a small share of global emissions. And this was kind of used as a justification of why there was no mitigation or why they didn't talk about reducing emissions.
Okay, so next, the effects of climate change on action, and we were looking at the effects of climate change and adaptation. So we had three different categories: the climate change local impacts, and that was if the EIS looked at whether climate change actually affected the surrounding environment of the proposed action, and reconstruction. And reconstruction is basically if the EIS discussed alternatives to have reconstruction if there was effects on the environment. And as you can see, only like 77% said yes, there is an impact on the local environment, but only 35%, so 11 EISs actually said there was going to be reconstruction. And this is kind of a little discrepancy because they should say that there is reconstruction if there's 24 that are saying that it does affect the environment. For adaptation, we're also looking at they're looking at the alternatives to see if there is resilience of the project and the alternatives, and only 4 EISs actually said that there's going to be resilience in the alternatives. So that's also a problem. That kind of means that they're just looking at the surface of everything and they're not really doing an in-depth analysis of all of this.
Okay, so that's a lot of numbers. What did we kind of take away from this, from our 31 EISs as a whole? So the first, as we've discussed, there were unaddressed categories like emissions mitigation, climate change adaptation. Another one was the social cost of carbon, which is a way to quantify in dollar terms what the carbon emissions will be. And that's really a simple calculation. The CUQ and the guidance outlines clearly why and how you should do it. Only one of the 31 did this. And we think that kind of the absence of these three categories really goes to show that these agencies are focused on short-term thinking, and they're not really looking at the long-term impacts of climate change and their project on climate change. So the climate change adaptation that Taylor was just talking about is a great example. Yes, the agencies are recognizing that climate change is going to impact their project environment, but they're not taking the next step and kind of projecting in the long term, how do we adapt our project so it can be more resilient and we won't have to rebuild it in the future or have to change in the future, and really thinking about adaptation in that way. Or with mitigation, how can we reduce our carbon footprint because climate change is real, it's happening, and we as a country need to be reducing our emissions. They're just doing the bare minimum kind of in this short-term framework. So, what are we doing next? Future work. So we're passing our findings along to Jessica and the Sabin Center, and they're going to send those to the CEQ, which is in the White House. That's pretty cool. And we're recommending that they continue to do this study, so expand the sample size. If we have more EISs, then we'll be able to look by agency, and then also looking at how future EISs are doing. Then kind of this is framed by how can the CEQ ensure that EISs better comply, take a more long-term holistic view of their projects in light of climate change. Now, I'm sure all of you are thinking, okay, like what's going to happen with Trump? I just want to address this really quickly because I know we'll get to in the Q&A too. But basically, Trump is 99% likely to rescind the CEQ's guidance on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's pretty scary. But this work is still important. There are kind of directives in the guidance that are tied to court cases that will still hold unless Congress passes a law saying that they won't. So we need to keep Congress accountable and watch out what's happening there. And a future administration will likely reinstate the guidance. So I think kind of one takeaway from this has been the EISs are really important tools. You've probably heard about them recently, the Dakota Access Pipeline and the decision on that, that needs to have an EIS to look at alternative routes. One quick note on that is that Trump or the Congress is likely to kind of sidestep that, so it's not a total victory. But we need to be thinking about EISs and holding our federal government accountable to accounting for climate change in all actions. Thank you.
Yeah, very nice presentation. Did you see any trends by category of the type of project that some projects might be complying, some categories of types of projects might be complying or not complying differently than others?
Is this, yeah, it's on. That's a great question. We didn't have too much time to present on that in today's presentation, but a pretty big part of our report is looking at trends by category as well. So like we mentioned, we had three main categories: fossil fuel infrastructure, built infrastructure, and natural resources management. And so all of them, as you can probably tell just by the names, have different things that kind of stand out. So for example, fossil fuel infrastructure projects are ones that we would have hoped would have definitely accounted for direct and indirect emissions. For the most part, they did. I don't have the exact numbers on that, but they did fall short, surprisingly, given that there, of course, are emissions, right? So we're looking at things, it's not as black and white as we'd hope for it to be, because it is a little bit confusing for agencies to, when they should quantify emissions, to what extent. But there are certain projects that we know there are emissions being produced and they should be quantified or qualified. The natural resource management projects were the ones, a lot of those included restoration and resilience projects. So those ones fared a little bit better in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but as you could see, those were still largely unaddressed. And built infrastructure was a pretty small sample size. There were only 3. So that fared pretty well in terms of emissions, but again, it's a small sample size. So that's why we're hoping to have this project continue and really get more categories, more EISs, and really fill it out so that we can have a robust analysis. So yeah, there were interesting trends across categories.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm the TA for the other section of this Capstone project. Really interesting findings and really timely as well. I'm sure everyone can agree. I'm just curious to know, how has working on this capstone kind of influenced what you all hope to pursue professionally after graduation, if at all?
These are like really interesting documents, yeah, but it hasn't really influenced me to go into this type of work. I'm more of a finance person, so this definitely was not something I would pursue, keep on reading these in the future.
I think the nature of the course has been really influential. This is obviously a very collaborative field of study. Definitely going to be working in groups for the rest of our lives. So definitely learning how to come together, have a plan of action when you get to the meeting time and be effective was definitely a good learning experience. I think we all said this was like the best group project we've ever had. So.
Yeah, and I think also it's just really interesting seeing everything that we learn. We learn about what mitigation is, we learn about what climate resilience is, but then seeing people actually having to put these into action and having to write documents when they're proposing anything that would have any sort of environmental effect, to actually have to think about that. So definitely, I think what I learned is just like accountability. So really, ultimately we're trying to hold agencies accountable, and not necessarily blaming them and saying that they're never accountable, but also trying to help them come up with the best ways of, going about creating these EISs. So I think I learned a lot about just different ways of presenting information, and I don't know, I hope to just, it kind of did influence me in trying to be involved more in terms of federal environmental decisions going forward, so.
For me, I think that it was very interesting to see a different side of sustainable or of sustainable development work from the legal perspective, and I think this is something that I definitely didn't get too much exposed to while studying studying sustainable development. I think while I don't want to be a lawyer or deal with that, knowing and learning about how these mechanisms work will be useful for a wide variety of work positions after. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is kind of in light of the Dakota Access Pipeline, what's happening with that. I'm really interested in kind of climate justice activism and seeing the intersections with federal regulation and kind of how those relate and how we can put pressure on the government in different ways. And like this on the face surface, when I started the project, thought it was gonna be kind of boring, but really like digging into it has been fascinating and learning about the implications of these 1,000-page reports.
Great comments. Just thinking a little bit about the point you made about sort of encouraging accountability and follow through. I was thinking with the new administration, even if we do sort of switch back in the future soon to an administration that, pursued these kind of directives, how much do you lose through the signal of, it's not so much a question to answer now, but you sort of the lost momentum, and does it take away some of that fuel and momentum towards getting agencies to take this kind of thing seriously? Maybe a quick comment and then we'll...
Sure. No, I definitely think that is a good point, and that's something that is a little scary looking forward. Just if we stop for 4 years, and especially if Congress passes a law that kind of rescinds NEPA itself, wherein these won't have to be done at all, what kind of implications that has in the going forward. We were talking to our client yesterday, though, and I think one of the important things we can focus on for the next 4 years is trying to strengthen state governments and kind of hoping that, like New York City has Plan YC, trying to encourage state governments to have more direct goals towards climate change and really trying to have state governments hold these agencies accountable when they're trying to carry out a proposed action in a certain state. But you're right, yeah, it's definitely activism, environmental advocacy groups, and state governments are what we have to hold on to for now.